Before we dive in, viewer discretion is advised. This content is for entertainment. What happens when one of Hollywood's most beloved actors, a man who's fought battles most of us can't even imagine, who's shown more grace under pressure than anyone, has a right to expect, walks into what should be a celebratory interview only to find himself ambushed by a host determined to tear him down? When someone who's dedicated decades to helping others suddenly finds themselves accused of exploitation on national television. When kindness meets cruelty, dignity faces down pettiness, and a warrior for millions reaches the breaking point that nobody thought existed. What you're about to witness is the moment Michael J. Fox, the legend, the fighter, the man who turned personal tragedy into global hope, discovered that even his legendary patience has limits. This isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is a day that Joy Behar learned what happens when you mistake gentleness for weakness and compassion for an easy target. This is the moment when America's most gracious star finally said enough. And trust me, what unfolds is nothing short of legendary. The explosion, the devastating truth bombs, the walk-off that left an entire studio in stunned silence, and a host realizing far too late that she just made the biggest mistake of her career. This is Michael J. Fox, like you've never seen him before. Still dignified, still controlled, but absolutely unmistakably done with the games. The View thought they were getting their usual ratings boost from a beloved celebrity. What they got instead was a masterclass in how truth, delivered with precision and powered by righteous anger, can dismantle false narrative in real time. Buckle up, because this confrontation doesn't just make television history. It redefines us what happens when you push a good man too far. The stage was set for what producers envision as a heartwarming segment. The kind of feel-good television that generates applause, breaks, and positive social media buzz. Michael J. Fox, the legendary actor known to generations for his roles in Back to the Future and Family Ties, was scheduled to appear on The View to discuss his latest advocacy work, the groundbreaking research his foundation was funding, and his upcoming projects. The producers had planned every detail, carefully soft lighting to flatter their distinguished guest, comfortable chairs arranged to encourage intimate conversation, camera angles designed to capture the warmth and admiration everyone felt for this remarkable man. The studio buzzed with genuine excitement in those minutes before the show began. The audience, carefully screened and seated, chatted animatedly among themselves, many sharing their favorite Michael J. Fox memories, scenes from movies, moments from his sitcoms, stories about his courage in the face of Parkinson's disease. Even the crew, usually jaded by years of celebrity appearances, seemed genuinely thrilled about today's guest. Camera operators checked their equipment with extra care. Sound engineers ran through their levels twice to ensure perfect audio. Producers reviewed their notes, confirming that every question was appropriate, every moment choreographed for maximum positive impact. The co-hosts prepared in their usual fashion. Whoopi Goldberg, the steady anchor of the show, reviewed her notes about Michael's foundation work, highlighting key accomplishments she wanted to celebrate. Sunny host smiled as she looked over recent articles about breakthrough Parkinson's research, ready to ask questions that would let Michael share his optimism. Sarah Haynes had compiled heartwarming stories about lives changed by the foundation's work. Perfect material for emotional moments that audiences loved. And then there was Joy Behar. While her colleagues prepared to celebrate their guests, Joy sat with a different energy entirely. There was something in her posture, something in the way she reviewed her notes with that particular intensity, something that those who knew her well might have recognized as trouble brewing. She'd been unusually quiet during the pre-show meeting, offering only brief nods when producers outlined the intended tone of the segment. Anyone paying close attention might have noticed the slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Not warmth, not excitement, but something more calculating. Little did anyone know that Joy had decided this interview would go in a very different direction from what everyone expected. She prepared questions that had nothing to do with the approved topics. She'd formulated arguments designed to provoke rather than enlighten. She convinced herself that she was going to create a moment, generate headlines, demonstrate that she wasn't afraid to ask tough questions, even of beloved figures. She had no idea what she was about to unleash. As Michael walked onto the set through those familiar studio doors, the crowd erupted into spontaneous, thunderous applause. It wasn't the polite golf clap of typical talk show audiences. This was genuine, heartfelt appreciation from people who'd grown up with this man, who'd watched him face down a devastating disease with courage and humor, who'd been inspired by his refusal to be defined by his condition. People stood, some wiped tears from their eyes, and the ovation continued for what felt like minutes rather than seconds. Michael waved graciously, that familiar smile lighting up his face. The same smile that had charmed audiences for 4 decades, though now weathered by years of struggle most people couldn't comprehend. He moved carefully toward the guest chair, his gait affected by the Parkinson's that had been his constant companion since 1991. But his dignity absolutely intact. Every step radiated grace under fire. Strength forged in battles fought daily in privacy. The other hosts stood to greet him warmly. Whoopi moved around the desk to embrace him, genuine affection evident in her face. Sarah beamed as she took his hand, clearly honored to be in the presence of someone she admired. Sunny's welcome was equally enthusiastic, her professional composure cracking slightly to reveal real excitement. But something felt different about Joy Behar's demeanor. While the others embraced the moment, genuinely delighted to have this icon in their presence, Joy remained seated. Her expression was notably cooler than her colleagues', that calculating look still playing around her eyes. She offered a brief nod, a perfunctory smile that didn't reach her eyes, and then returned her attention to her notes, as if Michael's arrival was merely routine rather than special. Those who knew what was coming might have recognized this for what it was. A predator positioning herself before the attack, a hunter waiting for precisely the right moment to strike. But Michael, gracious and unsuspecting, settled into his chair with that characteristic warmth that had endeared him to millions over the decades. "Michael, welcome back to the View," Whoopi began enthusiastically, her voice carrying genuine pleasure. "It's always such a pleasure to have you here. You look fantastic." "Thank you so much for having me," Michael replied, his voice carrying that familiar tenor that transported audiences back through years of beloved performances. "It's great to be back with all of you ladies." The conversation started pleasantly enough, flowing with the ease of people who genuinely liked each other. Sunny asked about his recent work with the Michael J. Fox Foundation, and Michael visibly lit up as he discussed the progress being made in Parkinson's research. His passion was evident, infectious even, as he explained the latest developments and how tantalizingly close researchers were getting to breakthrough treatments that could change everything for millions of patients. "The science has advanced so much in just the past few years," Michael explained, his voice filled with genuine optimism that came not from naive hope, but from understanding actual data, actual progress, actual breakthroughs happening in labs around the world. "We're seeing promising results in clinical trials, and I truly believe we're going to see some major breakthroughs in the next decade." Sarah leaned forward, clearly moved by his words, her professional distance dissolving in the face of his authenticity. "Your foundation has raised over $1 billion for research. That's just incredible, Michael. How does it feel to know you made such a massive impact?" Michael's humility shone through like sunlight through clouds as he deflected the praise with practiced grace. "It's not about me. It's about the thousands of researchers, donors, and advocates who make this work possible. I'm just grateful to be in a position where I can help amplify the message." The audience murmured appreciation. Cameras captured the warmth of the moment. This was exactly what everyone had expected, an uplifting conversation about courage, hope, and scientific progress. This was television that inspired rather than divided, that elevated rather than tore down. And then Joy decided it was her moment to strike. "Well, Michael," Joy said, her voice carrying a sharp edge that immediately cut to the pleasant atmosphere like a knife through silk, instantly catching everyone's attention with its jarring shift in tone. "Let's talk about something else for a moment. I have to ask you about some of the political positions you've taken over the years." The temperature in the studio dropped 20 degrees in that instant. The other hosts exchanged glances, clearly not expecting this sudden pivot away from the planned topics. Whoopi's eyebrows raised slightly, a warning sign that Joy was going off script. Sunny shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Sarah's smile faltered, confusion replacing the warmth that had been there moments before. Michael's expression remained polite, gracious even, but there was a subtle tension that crept into his posture. Those who knew him well who'd watched him navigate difficult interviews over decades, might have recognized the slight stiffening of his shoulders, the barely perceptible change in his breathing pattern. "I'm not sure what you mean, Joy," Michael responded carefully, his voice still friendly, but now carrying an undertone of caution. "I try to stay focused on health advocacy rather than partisan politics." Joy wasn't deterred. In fact, she seemed emboldened by his diplomatic response, as if she'd been waiting for exactly this opening. "Oh, come on, Michael," she said with a dismissive wave that bordered on condescending. "You've been pretty vocal about certain issues. Some people might say you use your condition to push a particular agenda." The studio felt noticeably quiet. Even the audience, who moments before had been engaged and responsive, seemed to sense that something uncomfortable was happening. The pleasant energy that filled the space evaporated, replaced by tension that you could cut with a knife. Whoopi looked like she wanted to redirect the conversation, her mouth opening to intervene. But Joy pressed on before anyone could stop her momentum. "I mean, let's be honest here," Joy continued, her tone becoming increasingly confrontational with each word, leaning into the attack now that she committed to it. "You've received a lot of sympathy over the years because of your diagnosis. Some critics have suggested that you've leveraged that sympathy for political gain." Michael's jaw tightened slightly, just a fraction, barely visible to most viewers, but unmistakably there. His hands, which had been resting casually on the arms of his chair, tensed. But he maintained his composure with control that comes from decades of dealing with far worse than verbal attacks on television. "Joy, I think you're mischaracterizing my advocacy work," he said, his voice still measured, but now with steel underneath the velvet. "When I speak about healthcare or research funding, it's because these issues affect millions of people, not just me." But you have to admit, Joy shot back with the confidence of someone who believed she was making an important journalistic point rather than simply being cruel. That your celebrity status and your condition give you a platform that others don't have. And you've used that platform to support candidates and causes that some Americans disagree with. The other hosts were clearly uncomfortable now, their body language screaming disapproval, even as professional obligation kept them in their seats. Sarah shifted nervously, looking for an escape from the situation. Sonny looked down at her notes, as if searching desperately for a way to change the subject. The tension was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Whoopi finally tried to step in, her voice carrying the authority of the show's moderator. "Joy, maybe we should focus on Michael's foundation work," she suggested diplomatically, trying to throw a lifeline to both her guest and her colleague. But Joy was relentless, drunk on what she perceived as journalistic courage, rather than recognizing for the ambush it actually was. "No, I think this is important, Whoopi," she insisted, waving off the attempted intervention. "Michael, you appeared in political ads. You've made statements about healthcare policy. You can't just hide behind your foundation when it's convenient." Michael's famous composure was beginning to crack now, hairline fractures appearing in the calm facade he'd maintained through thousands of interviews. His voice remained steady, but there was a steely quality to it now that hadn't been there before, a warning that those paying attention should have heeded. "I'm not hiding behind anything, Joy," he said, each word precisely articulated. "I'm using my voice to advocate for medical research and healthcare access. If you find that controversial, then I think we have very different ideas about what's important." "What I find controversial," Joy retorted, clearly not recognizing or perhaps not caring about the warning signs that she was pushing a fundamentally decent man toward a breaking point, "is when celebrities think their personal struggles give them special authority to influence public policy. You're an actor, Michael, not a policy expert." The tension in the studio was now absolutely palpable, electric, dangerous. The audience was dead silent, barely breathing, unable to believe what they were witnessing. Even the camera operators seemed uncomfortable, unsure whether they should keep filming or somehow intervene in this train wreck unfolding before them. The professional crew, who'd seen thousands of interviews, could sense that something was going very wrong, that they were witnessing something that would have consequences far beyond a single episode. Michael sat back in his chair, his hands now clasped together tightly, clearly processing what was happening, making calculations about how to respond to accusations that went far beyond mere disagreement into personal attack territory. Joy, Michael said slowly, his voice still controlled, but with an unmistakable edge that cut to the studio like a laser. I've been living with Parkinson's for over 3 decades. I've worked with researchers, doctors, and policymakers around the world. I think that gives me at least some insight into these issues. Joy leaned forward aggressively, sensing what she mistook for weakness, but was actually a man gathering his strength before a response. But that's exactly my point, she said triumphantly, as if she'd scored a debating victory rather than simply being cruel. You've turned your personal situation into a career. Some people might call that exploitation. That was the moment when something fundamental shifted in Michael's demeanor, when a line was crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. The polite smile that had been his default expression for 40 years of public life disappeared completely. His eyes flashed with an anger that few had ever seen from this typically gentle, gracious man. His entire body language transformed from accommodating guest to warrior prepared for battle. Exploitation, Michael repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level that was somehow more powerful than shouting would have been. Joy, I think you need to be very careful about what you're suggesting here. The other hosts were now visibly alarmed, sensing that Joy had pushed far beyond acceptable boundaries into territory that would have serious consequences. Whoopi placed her hand on the desk, as if ready to physically intervene if necessary. Sarah looked like she wanted to disappear entirely, to somehow teleport out of the situation. Sonny sat frozen, unable to believe this was actually happening on their show. But Joy, emboldened by what she seemed to perceive as weakness rather than the gathering storm it actually was, doubled down on her attack with breathtaking recklessness. I'm just saying what a lot of people are thinking, Michael, Joy said with a dismissive wave of her hand that would haunt her in replays for years to come. You've built an entire second career on being sick. The foundation, the speaking engagements, the political endorsements, it's all tied to your condition. Michael's hands, which had been remarkably steady throughout the interview, despite the tremors that Parkinson's typically causes, now clenched into fists. The control he'd maintained for decades, the grace under pressure that had defined his public persona, was being tested in ways that perhaps nothing else in his long career had tested it. My foundation has funded research that has helped millions of people worldwide, he said, his voice vibrating with barely contained emotion. If you think that's exploitation, then you clearly don't understand what we're trying to accomplish. Oh, I understand perfectly, Joy shot back, completely oblivious to the disaster she was creating for herself and her show. You created this saint-like image of yourself as a brave celebrity fighting disease, and nobody's allowed to question it because you're sick. It's brilliant marketing, really. The audience gasped audibly at this comment, an actual collective intake of breath that the microphones captured perfectly. Several people in the crowd started murmuring, their voices rising in disapproval. It was clear that Joy had crossed a line that even her most loyal viewers found completely unacceptable. The damage was being done in real time, broadcast to millions, irreversible and damning. But she wasn't finished. Incredibly, impossibly, she continued digging herself deeper into the hole she created. And let's talk about those political ads you did. Joy continued relentlessly, seemingly addicted now to her own perceived courage, standing there shaking, making people feel sorry for you so they'd vote a certain way. Some might call that emotional manipulation. Michael stood up abruptly. The sudden movement caught everyone completely off guard. His chair rolled backward from the force of his standing. The sound of wheels on the studio floor somehow loud, and the stunned silence. For a moment, a long, stretched-out moment that seemed to last an eternity. The studio was completely silent, except for the hum of cameras and lighting equipment, except for the sound of a man who'd been pushed too far, finally reaching his limit. That's enough, Michael said, his voice now carrying the full weight of 30 years of public scrutiny. Private struggle, daily battles fought with courage most people couldn't imagine. Joy, I came here today to talk about hope, about research, about the future we're building for people who are suffering. But you've turned this into something ugly. His voice didn't rise to a shout. It didn't need to. The quiet power in his words was more devastating than screaming would have been, more effective than rage, more cutting than any theatrical display of anger. Joy, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of the moment she created, incredibly pressed on even as the entire studio held its breath. I'm just asking the tough questions that other interviewers are afraid to ask, she said, somehow still believing she was performing journalism rather than cruelty. Isn't that what journalism is supposed to be about? Journalism? Michael laughed, but it was bitter, sharp, containing no humor whatsoever. This isn't journalism, Joy. This is a performance. You're trying to create a moment at my expense, and frankly, it's disgusting. Whoopi finally found her voice again, trying desperately to salvage something from this disaster. Michael, please, let's just take a step back here. No, Whoopi. Michael cut her off, though his tone toward her remained respectful, acknowledging that she wasn't the problem here. I appreciate you trying to mediate, but Joy needs to hear this. You want to talk about exploitation? Let's talk about a talk show host who thinks attacking a guest with a chronic illness makes for good television. Joy's face flushed red as the accusation landed. Her voice rose defensively, pride overriding whatever small voice of reason might have been trying to warn her. I'm not attacking you because you're sick, Michael. I'm questioning your methods. Your motives? My motives? Michael's voice cracked with genuine emotion now, the careful control slipping to reveal the hurt underneath the anger. My motive is to find a cure for a disease that affects over 10 million people worldwide. My motive is to give hope to families who are watching their loved ones deteriorate day by day. What exactly are your motives here, Joy? The question hung in the air like a sword suspended over Joy's head. The entire studio seemed to lean forward, waiting for her answer, knowing there was no good response possible. Joy shifted uncomfortably in her seat, perhaps finally beginning to realize that she had pushed far beyond acceptable boundaries. But her pride wouldn't let her back down now. Wouldn't let her admit the mistake that everyone watching could clearly see. My motive is to have an honest conversation without the usual celebrity worship, Joy replied, though her voice lacked the confidence it had carried throughout the attack. The certainty was gone, replaced by defensiveness that everyone could hear. Celebrity worship. Michael shook his head in genuine disbelief. Joy, I've been transparent about my condition for 3 decades. I've shared my struggles, my setbacks, my fears. I've let cameras follow me on my worst days so that people could understand what this disease really looks like. And you call that exploitation? Sarah tried to interject, her voice small and apologetic. Michael, we all have tremendous respect for what you've accomplished. Do you, Sarah? Michael turned to face her, his expression softening slightly because he knew she wasn't responsible for this ambush. Because your colleague here just suggested that I built my career on being sick, that I manipulate people's emotions for political gain. Is that the respect you're talking about? Joy couldn't stay quiet, couldn't let the moment pass without defending herself, even though defense was impossible. I never said you built your career on being sick. You were already famous when you were diagnosed. Then what exactly are you saying, Joy? Michael demanded, turning back to face her directly, his presence now commanding the entire studio in a way that no anger could have achieved. Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you're suggesting that everything I've done since my diagnosis has been somehow dishonest or self-serving. I'm saying that you've used your platform in ways that go beyond medical advocacy, Joy replied, still trying desperately to maintain some intellectual high ground. You've endorsed political candidates. You've taken positions on policy issues that have nothing to do with Parkinson's. Michael stepped closer to Joy's side of the desk, not threatening, but absolutely commanding, his presence filling the space with undeniable authority. So, what you're really upset about is that I don't share your political views. This isn't about journalism or tough questions. This is about silencing a voice you disagree with. That's not true, Joy protested weakly, but her voice wavered, betraying her own uncertainty. Isn't it? Michael pressed forward, the lawyer presenting his case to a jury that had already made up its mind. Because if this were really about accountability or transparency, you would have done your homework. You would know that our foundation operates with complete financial transparency. You would know that the research we fund is peer-reviewed and published in medical journals. You would know that every penny we spend is tracked and reported. Joy opened her mouth to respond, but Michael continued before she could formulate a defense, his words coming faster now as the full scope of his anger and disappointment poured out. But you didn't do that homework, did you, Joy? Instead, you decided to ambush me with accusations and innuendo. You thought you could score points by attacking someone with a chronic illness on national television. The studio was so quiet that the cameras picked up every subtle sound, the slight tremor in Michael's voice that came from emotion rather than disease, the uncomfortable shifting of bodies in the audience, the barely audible whisper of someone backstage saying, "Oh my God, you know what the real tragedy is here?" Michael continued, his voice now carrying decades of passion, frustration, and dedication to a cause larger than himself. There are researchers right now in labs around the world working 18-hour days trying to unlock the mysteries of neurodegenerative diseases. There are patients and families who need hope, who need to know that someone is fighting for them. And instead of talking about that, instead of using this platform to educate people or inspire them to get involved, you've chosen to tear down the very efforts that might save lives. Joy's defensive posture was beginning to crumble visibly, and for the first time since the interview began, she seemed to understand the magnitude of her misstep. "Michael, I think maybe we should," she started, her voice noticeably quieter than it had been throughout the entire confrontation. "No, Joy." Michael cut her off firmly, allowing no escape from the reckoning she created. "You don't get to backtrack now. You wanted to have this conversation, so let's have it. You accused me of exploiting my condition for personal gain. You suggested that I manipulate people's emotions for political purposes. Those are serious accusations, and I think the audience deserves to hear you defend them." Joy looked around the studio helplessly, as if searching for support from her co-hosts or even the audience. But the mood in the room had shifted completely and irreversibly. What had started as excited anticipation for a beloved guest had turned into uncomfortable silence and barely concealed disapproval of Joy's behavior. Some audience members shook their heads. Others looked at Joy with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright disgust. "I was just trying to ask challenging questions," Joy said weakly, the fight going out of her voice as she finally recognized the disaster she created. "Challenging questions?" Michael's voice rose with indignation, but still maintained a controlled power that made every word land with devastating force. "Joy, a challenging question would be asking about specific research protocols or funding allocation. A challenging question would be asking about the ethics of celebrity advocacy or the responsibility that comes with having a platform. What you did was launch personal attacks, disguised as journalism. Whoopi tried once more to salvage something from this train wreck." Michael, I think what Joy was trying to get at, but Michael held up his hand to stop her, respectful but firm. "Whoopi, I appreciate your loyalty to your colleague, but there's no defending what happened here today. Joy made a calculated decision to attack me personally, and she needs to own that." The cameras captured Joy's face as she struggled to respond, and the image would become iconic. A host who'd finally pushed too far, who'd mistaken a good man's grace for vulnerability, who'd learned too late that kindness has limits and patience can break. Gone was the confident, combative host who had dominated the first part of the interview. In her place sat a woman who clearly realized she had miscalculated catastrophically, who was beginning to understand that this moment would define her career in ways she'd never intended. "I never intended to attack you personally," Joy said quietly, almost pleading. "But that's exactly what you did," Michael replied without hesitation. "You questioned my integrity, my motives, and my character. You suggested that I built my advocacy work on deception and manipulation. How is that not personal?" Sarah, who had remained largely silent during the confrontation, finally spoke up with desperation in her voice. "Michael, I think everyone here recognizes the incredible work you've done and the impact you've had." Michael turned to her with a sad smile. Genuine warmth for someone who wasn't responsible for this disaster. "I appreciate that, Sarah, but the damage is already done. Your show just broadcasts to millions of people's suggestion that my life's work is somehow fraudulent or self-serving. How do you think that affects the families who depend on our research? How do you think that affects the donors who support our work?" The weight of his words settled over the studio like a heavy blanket of shame. For the first time since the interview began, Joy seemed to grasp the broader implications of her actions beyond the immediate controversy. "I didn't think about it that way," Joy admitted reluctantly, her voice barely audible. That's the problem, Joy, Michael said, his voice carrying both anger and profound disappointment. You didn't think. You saw an opportunity to create controversy, to generate headlines, and you took it without considering the consequences for the people whose lives depend on the work we're doing. Michael walked back toward his chair slowly, deliberately, but instead of sitting down to continue the interview, he reached for his jacket. The simple gesture sent a message that reverberated throughout the studio, louder than any words could have. This interview was over, his patience exhausted, his willingness to engage completely spent. "Wait, Michael, you don't have to leave," Whoopi said quickly, genuine concern in her voice. "We still have time left in the segment. We can talk about the research, about the foundation work." Michael paused as he put on his jacket, looking directly at Whoopi with genuine respect and affection that made clear his departure wasn't about her. "Whoopi, you've always been gracious to me, and I have nothing but respect for you, but I can't continue to sit here and pretend that what just happened is acceptable." He turned to face the audience directly, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed studio, speaking not to the hosts, but to the millions watching at home who needed to hear his truth. "To everyone watching at home, I want you to know that the work we do at the Michael J. Fox Foundation isn't about me," he said, his voice strong and clear despite the emotion behind it. "It's about the brilliant scientists who dedicate their lives to finding answers. It's about the patients who volunteer for clinical trials, knowing they might not benefit personally, but hoping they can help others. It's about the caregivers who sacrifice everything to support their loved ones." The audience began to applaud softly at first, hesitant, then building to a sustained ovation that grew louder with each passing second. Several people stood up, their approval unmistakable. Soon, most of the studio audience was on their feet, showing their support for Michael and their clear disapproval of how he had been treated. The standing ovation continued, building in intensity, a rebuke more powerful than any words could have delivered. Joy sat frozen in her chair, clearly overwhelmed by the audience's reaction, by the visible evidence of how badly she misjudged the situation. The other hosts clapped politely, but their discomfort was evident in every forced smile and uncomfortable glance toward their colleague. "The real tragedy here," Michael continued over the sustained applause, his words cutting through even as people continued to clap, "is that we had an opportunity to talk about hope, about scientific breakthroughs, about the possibility of a world without Parkinson's disease. Instead, we wasted that opportunity on manufactured controversy." He looked directly at Joy one final time, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I've spent 30 years learning to live with this disease, and I've spent the last 25 years working to ensure that others won't have to. I've been transparent about my struggles, my successes, and my failures. I've opened my life to public scrutiny because I believe it serves a greater purpose." Joy finally found her voice, though it was barely above a whisper and carried none of its earlier confidence. "Michael, I'm sorry if I offended you. If you offended me?" Michael shook his head slowly. "Joy, there's no if about it. You did offend me. You offended millions of people who are fighting this disease every single day. You offended the researchers who work tirelessly to find a cure. And you offended the basic principles of respectful discourse." The studio fell silent again as Michael prepared to leave, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. He took a step toward the exit, then turned back one final time, unable to let the moment pass without making one last crucial point. "You know what's really sad about this whole situation?" Michael asked, his voice filled with genuine disappointment that cut deeper than anger ever could. "I came here today excited to share some incredible news about recent research breakthroughs. There are trials happening right now that could change everything for people with Parkinson's. There are new treatments on the horizon that could dramatically improve quality of life for patients and their families." He paused, letting his words sink in, making sure everyone understood exactly what had been lost in Joy's quest for controversy. But instead of talking about that hope, instead of inspiring people to get involved or support research, we spent our time on this pointless conflict. That's the real loss here. Not to me, but to the millions of people who needed to hear a message of hope today. Without another word, without waiting for response or rebuttal, Michael J. Fox walked off the set of The View with his head held high and his dignity absolutely intact. He left behind a stunned studio, a host who finally understood the magnitude of her mistake, an audience that continued their applause until he disappeared from view. The cameras continued rolling as Joy sat in uncomfortable silence, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The other hosts looked at each other uncertainly, unsure how to proceed. The audience's applause slowly faded, replaced by whispered conversations and visible disapproval. As the show cut to commercial break, the damage was already done and spreading. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation would be circulating on social media. Within hours, it would be the top trending topic on every platform. Within days, Joy Behar would find herself at the center of a controversy entirely of her own making, one that would overshadow any point she tried to make. What started as a routine celebrity interview became a defining moment in television history. Michael J. Fox, pushed beyond the limits of his legendary patience, had shown America what happens when kindness is mistaken for weakness, when grace under pressure is confused with an inability to fight back. He proved that the quietest voices can deliver the most devastating truths. That walking away with dignity is more powerful than staying to argue. That sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to participate in someone else's ugly game. Was he right to walk off the set? Should he have stayed to continue the conversation? Those questions missed a fundamental point. Joy Behar created a situation where the only appropriate response was exactly what Michael delivered. Truth spoken clearly, boundaries enforced firmly, and dignity maintained absolutely. The real question isn't whether Michael was too sensitive or Joy too harsh. It's whether we as society will continue to allow performative cruelty disguised as tough journalism, whether we'll keep rewarding hosts who mistake attack for insight and controversy for courage. Michael J. Fox answered that question by walking away. And in that simple act of refusal, he reminded America what real strength looks